Right, picture the scene. September 13 TAs ke 1882. 40,000 men standing in absolute silence in the Egyptian desert. No more torches, no more voices, nothing but the sound of sun shifting beneath thousands of boots. In 6 hours, they'll launch one of the most audacious surprise attacks in military history. But right now, in this exact moment, one wrong move could cost them absolutely everything. This is the story of how General Garnet Wolseley marched an entire army through pitch darkness across one of the most unforgiving landscapes on earth, and he changed the course of an empire. And to understand how we got here, to this moment in the darkness, we need to go back. Because this story doesn't start in the desert. It starts with money, with debt, with empires competing for dominance. It starts with one of the most important waterways ever built. Main content: picture Egypt in the mid-19th century. The pyramids standing as they had for millennia, the Nile flowing as it always had. But beneath that timeless surface, everything was changing. Cotton was booming, railways were being built, and someone had an audacious idea. What if you could shoot a canal through the desert connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea? What if you could create a shortcut between Europe and Asia? The French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps made the dream real. The Suez Canal opened in 1869 with enormous fanfare. 100 miles of artificial waterway carved through the desert. Ships that once took months to reach India could now make the journey in weeks. And the British, who'd initially opposed the project, quickly realized what they had. This wasn't just any canal. This was the lifeline that held the British Empire together. Before the Suez, British ships sailing to India had to go all the way around Africa, down the Atlantic coast, around the Cape of Good Hope where storms could sink even the strongest vessels, then up the eastern coast and across the Indian Ocean. The journey took months, but now, shoot through Egypt and save weeks of travel time and countless lives. The Suez Canal wasn't just convenient, it was the artery pumping blood through the empire. But here's the problem: Egypt wasn't British. The canal ran through someone else's country. Egypt was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, that vast but declining power based in Constantinople. In practice, Egypt was effectively independent under its own ruler, the Khedive. And in the 1870s, the Khedive was Ismail the Magnificent. Khedive Ismail had grand visions. He wanted to make Egypt a modern, European-style nation. He built palaces rivaling anything in Paris or Vienna. He constructed the Cairo Opera House. He modernized Alexandria's harbor. And all of this cost money, enormous amounts of money Egypt didn't have. So Ismail borrowed from British banks, French banks, anyone who'd lend. And the terms were brutal. Interest rates were astronomical, often 20% or more. By the mid-1870s, Egypt was spending more than half its entire government revenue just paying interest on foreign loans. Not paying back the principal, just the interest. In 1875, Ismail was so desperate he made a fateful decision. He sold his shares in the Suez Canal Company. Nearly half the company's stock sold in a single transaction. And who bought them? The British government under Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. The story goes that Disraeli, hearing the shares were available, acted with remarkable speed. He borrowed £4 million from the Rothschild banking family and he bought the shares before the French government could organize a competing bid. Just like that, Britain owned a massive stake in the most strategically important waterway in the world. But owning shares didn't solve Egypt's fundamental problem. The debt kept growing. In 1876, the British and the French governments established something called the Caisse de la Dette Publique, the Public Debt Commission. Sounds bureaucratic and boring, right? It was anything but. This commission had power to oversee Egypt's finances, to ensure debt payments were made before anything else. Foreign commissioners sat in Egyptian government offices reviewing expenditures, blocking payments they didn't approve. Egypt was losing control of its own economy. Imagine you're an Egyptian watching this happen. You see your country's wealth flowing out to foreign banks. You see foreigners in your government offices making decisions about your country's future. You see taxes rising to pay foreign debts whilst local services suffer. And you start asking, why? Why do we accept this? Why don't we take back control of our own country? Those questions were spreading through Egyptian society in the late 1870s. Army officers asked them, particularly native Egyptian officers like Ahmed Urabi. The officer corps was divided between an elite of Turkish and the Circassian officers, descendants of the old Ottoman ruling class, and the native Egyptian officers. The Turkish officers got the promotions, the prestigious commands, the respect. Egyptian officers, no matter how talented, hit a ceiling. Ahmed Urabi came from a farming family in Lower Egypt. His father was a village headman, respectable but not wealthy. Urabi joined the army as a young man and he rose through the ranks through sheer competence and the hard work. He was intelligent, well-read, and deeply aware of the injustices around him. Other Egyptian officers looked to him as someone who'd speak for them, someone who wouldn't accept the status quo. In 1881, Urabi and his fellow Egyptian officers decided they'd had enough. They staged a demonstration at Abdin Palace in Cairo where the Khedive resided. They had demands: dismiss the Turkish Minister of War, increase the size of the Egyptian army, convene a parliament, give Egyptians a real voice in governing Egypt. The Khedive, Tawfiq, who'd succeeded Ismail, was terrified. He agreed to the demands. Urabi became Minister of War. Egyptian nationalists celebrated. The slogan "Egypt for the Egyptians" resonated powerfully. It wasn't just political, it was emotional. It was about dignity and self-respect and refusing to be treated as inferior in your own land. Ordinary Egyptians rallied behind Urabi. He became a symbol of resistance to foreign domination. But in London and Paris, the nationalist movement looked very different. It looked like chaos, like a threat to vital interests. British newspapers ran alarming stories about Egyptian fanaticism and instability. They portrayed Urabi as a dangerous radical who might close the Suez Canal or expel foreigners or default on debt. Prime Minister William Gladstone was a liberal who'd spent years criticizing imperialism. He'd argued for restraint and non-intervention. Now in power, he found himself pushed toward exactly the kind of intervention he'd opposed. He tried diplomacy. He coordinated with the French. He sent warning messages to Cairo. But events were moving faster than diplomacy could manage. The trigger came in June 1882. Riots broke out in Alexandria. The causes were tangled: nationalist demonstrations, ethnic tensions, economic grievances. In the riot, Europeans were attacked. About 50 Europeans died. Survivors told horrific stories of being hunted through the streets. Whether these accounts were accurate or exaggerated became almost irrelevant. They were believed, and in the British press they became proof that Egypt under Urabi was descending into barbarism. The Royal Navy was already in the Mediterranean. Admiral Beauchamp Seymour commanded a powerful squadron anchored off Alexandria. Seymour was old school, a Crimean War veteran who believed in applying force to solve problems. He looked at the situation and he saw a simple solution. The Egyptian army was fortifying the city, building up coastal defenses. Seymour saw this as a threat. He issued an ultimatum: stop fortifying Alexandria or face bombardment. Urabi refused. He couldn't back down without losing credibility. On July 11, 1882, the British Mediterranean Squadron opened fire. For 10.5 hours, British warships pounded Alexandria. Egyptian forts fired back but were outmatched. By evening, Egyptian coastal defenses were in ruins. Fires burned across the city. The bombardment was meant as a show of overwhelming force. It had exactly the opposite effect. If anything, it strengthened Urabi's position. He was now the man standing up to foreign aggression. Egyptian people rallied behind him. Britain realized half measures weren't going to work. If they wanted to secure their interests in Egypt, they'd need to send an army. That's where General Garnet Wolseley enters our story. Born in Ireland in 1833, Wolseley had seen his first combat in Burma in the early 1850s. He was fearless, perhaps recklessly so. A bullet shattered his thigh. He survived but limped for the rest of his life. He fought in the Crimean War where he lost his left thigh when a shell exploded nearby. He was 22 and he already had 2 serious wounds. Most men would have left the army. Wolseley went looking for more action. He served in the Indian Rebellion of 1857, fought in China during the Second Opium War, commanded expeditions to Canada and West Africa. Every campaign taught him something. He developed strong opinions about how armies should be organized. He believed in merit as the basis for promotion. He believed in thorough preparation and detailed planning. He believed in innovation. Wolseley had also written a book, The Soldier's Pocketbook for Field Service, published in ke-1869. Officers across the British Army read it. When the government needed someone to lead the Egyptian expedition, Wolseley was the obvious choice. Wolseley arrived in Egypt in August 1882 with a clear mission: defeat Urabi's forces, restore the Khedive's authority, secure British interests, particularly the Suez Canal. He brought some of the finest troops in the British Army, the Highland Brigade including the Black Watch and the Cameron Highlanders, the Guards Brigade with the Grenadier and the Coldstream Guards, and the Indian regiments from the British Indian Army. But Wolseley faced serious challenges. Egypt in late summer was brutally hot. Daytime temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees. British soldiers from cool, damp Britain had to adjust to conditions that could literally kill. Heat exhaustion, heat stroke, dehydration weren't just inconveniences, they were serious threats. Then Sir was Urabi. He'd had months to prepare defenses. He concentrated his main strength at Tel El Kebir, a village about 70 miles northeast of Cairo. It was a strong position, carefully chosen. The village sat astride the main route from the Suez Canal to Cairo. Anyone advancing on the capital would have to deal with Tel El Kebir. Urabi's men, somewhere around 25 to 30,000, spent weeks digging in. They constructed earthwork fortifications, long lines of trenches and the defensive walls stretching for miles. They flooded areas using water from the canal, creating marshy obstacles. Urabi positioned his artillery to cover approaches. His guns weren't as modern as British artillery, but they were still dangerous. Wolseley studied the situation carefully. A frontal assault in daylight against these prepared defenses would be costly, perhaps disastrously so. Even with superior training and the equipment, British troops attacking across open ground toward fortified positions would be shot down long before they reached Egyptian lines. He'd seen it before in other campaigns. Andy and Wolseley had his idea. What if they didn't attack in daylight? What if they marched at night and hit the Egyptian positions at dawn? At that critical moment when defenders would be at their least alert, when darkness would prevent them seeing the attack coming, when surprise could substitute for overwhelming force. It was audacious. Moving an entire army across open desert in complete darkness, keeping them together and properly oriented, getting them into position at precisely the right moment. The logistical challenges were enormous. If the Egyptians discovered the movement, if the British army became disorganized in darkness, if units lost their way, the result could be catastrophic defeat. But if it worked, if they could achieve complete surprise, they could overwhelm the defenses before the Egyptians realized what was happening. Surprise had always been one of the most powerful weapons in warfare. Wolseley began preparations with characteristic thoroughness. First came intelligence gathering. He needed to know everything about Tel El Kebir. He sent out reconnaissance parties, small groups of scouts who crept close to Egyptian lines under cover of darkness, mapping positions, counting troops, observing routines. These missions were incredibly dangerous. Some scouts didn't make it back, but the information was invaluable. But knowing where the enemy wasn't enough. Wolseley needed to practice the actual operation, so he organized rehearsal marches. Units practiced moving in silence, maintaining formation in darkness, following guides they could barely see. Officers learned to recognize their units by touch and the whispered passwords. Soldiers practiced loading and fixing bayonets by feel alone. The rehearsals revealed problems that could be fixed before the actual operation. Some units struggled to maintain contact with adjacent units. The solution was liaison officers between units. Some soldiers made too much noise. The solution was inspecting equipment, wrapping anything that might rattle in cloth. Some units moved too fast or too slow. The solution was establishing a standard patch and training commanders to maintain it precisely. Navigation was perhaps the biggest challenge. In the desert at night, with no more landmarks visible and no more lights allowed, how do you keep 40,000 men moving in the right direction? Wolseley's solution demonstrated both technical knowledge and the creative thinking. First, naval support. The Royal Navy stationed ships off the coast with powerful lights that could be seen from inland. British surveyors could take compass bearings from these lights. Then came celestial navigation. Officers were trained to use stars for navigation. In the clear desert sky, Stars were bright and easy to identify. Polaris provided a fixed reference point. Officers were issued compasses and star charts. During the march, navigating officers would be positioned at the front, constantly checking bearings and making course corrections. And there was the railway. The Cairo-Suez Railway ran near the intended line of march. Units could use the railway as a guide, following it or moving parallel to maintain correct direction. But even with careful planning, Wolseley knew success also required deception. He needed urabitising the British attack would come from a different direction or at a different time. So Wolseley launched a series of demonstrations in the days before the main attack. British troops would advance toward Egyptian lines during the day as if preparing for assault. They'd deploy into attack formations, move forward, exchange fire, then pull back before actually launching assault. This happened multiple times over several days. From Urabi's perspective, the British were probing defenses but were cautious, unwilling to launch full assault. Each false alarm wore down Egyptian defenders, made them less alert, made them think when the real attack came, they'd have warning. On September 12 th, 1882, everything was ready. The main British force was positioned at Kasassin, about 10 miles west of Tel El Kebir. The atmosphere in camp was tense. Soldiers knew something big was coming. Veterans recognized the signs. Younger soldiers who'd never been in real battle felt a mixture of excitement and fear. Wolseley assembled his senior officers for final briefing. The march would begin at jam 1:30 in the morning. Absolute silence was mandatory. The navigators understood their responsibilities. Different brigades had specific assignments. The Highland Brigade would lead, targeting the Egyptian left flank. The Guards Brigade would attack the center. Indian brigades would strike the right. Cavalry would wait in reserve. By late afternoon, every soldier knew the plan, at least a piece of it. And then came the waiting. Soldiers tried to rest but men couldn't sleep. Some wrote letters home. Some checked equipment repeatedly. Some talked quietly with comrades. Think about what each soldier carried. His rifle, the Martini Henry, standard British infantry weapon. A single-shot breech-loading rifle firing a powerful 45 calibre round. Each soldier carried 70 rounds of ammunition. There was the bayonet, water bottle absolutely critical in the desert, food, first aid kit, great coat. All this equipment added up to 60 or 70 pounds each soldier carried. As evening fell, soldiers ate a final meal. Then came final equipment checks. Officers walked through ranks examining soldiers, making sure everything was properly secured, that nothing would rattle during the march. And then at jam 1:30 in the morning of September 13 th, the order came, move out. The Highland Brigade began to move. 40,000 men rose and moved forward into darkness. The silence was uncanny, almost unnatural. The only sounds were soft crunch of boots on sand, breathing of thousands of men, occasional creak of leather equipment. Officers moved up and down columns like ghosts, whispering reminders about noise discipline. The guides at the front bore enormous responsibility. These navigators moved forward with compasses in hand, frequently stopping to check bearings against stars. Every few hundred yards, the lead navigator would pause, take a bearing, consult with fellow guides, adjust the line of march if needed. Behind him, 40,000 men followed blindly, trusting these navigators knew where they were going. The march became almost meditative. Left foot, right foot, hour after hour. The desert seeming to stretch endlessly. The desert at night was cold. Men shivered as they marched. The ground was treacherous. Small wadis jut across the line of march. Rocky patches threatened to turn ankles. In some areas, sand was soft and deep, making every step an effort. Hours passed. 2 miles covered, then 3, then 4. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. Around 4 in the morning, about 3 hours into the march, disaster nearly struck. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, a dog barked. The entire British army froze. 40,000 men stopped moving in an instant, hardly daring to breathe. The dog barked again. Different dogs joined in. For a few seconds, there was a chorus of barking. Officers strained their ears listening for human voices, for shouts of alarm. If Egyptian sentries investigated, if they discovered the British army less than 3 miles from their fortifications, the whole operation would be compromised. Seconds stretched. The dogs continued barking for perhaps a minute, then gradually subsided. Silence returned. No more alarm had been raised. After a few agonizing minutes, whispered orders rippled down the column, resume march. And the great army began moving again, perhaps even more cautiously. The march continued. 5 miles covered, then 6, then 7. Soldiers' legs burned with fatigue. Blisters were breaking open. Shoulders itched. Mouths were dry. But nobody fell out. Nobody complained audibly. As 5 o'clock approached, the guides signaled they were nearing the objective. Close now, very close. They'd covered approximately 9 miles in just over 4 hours, exactly on schedule. They signaled for the army to halt. They would wait here for first light of dawn, then attack. 40,000 men settled into positions, still maintaining absolute silence. They were formed into assault formations. Highland Brigade on the left, Guards in center, Indian brigades on right. And then gradually, almost imperceptibly, the sky began to change. It started as barely noticeable lightning on the eastern horizon. The soldiers, it meant they could start making out vague shapes. The man next to you was no more longer just a presence but a dim figure you could see. And sir, emerging from the gloom, were the Egyptian earthworks. Long dark lines of fortifications stretching across the front. Artillery pieces jutting from defensive walls. It was exactly where reconnaissance reports said it would be. The British Army had executed a 9-mile night march across open desert and arrived in perfect position, completely undetected. Egyptian defenders weren't at their posts. Why would they be? It was that quiet period just before dawn when human alertness is at its lowest. But this time, the threat was real. British soldiers, thousands of them, were less than 400 yards from Egyptian fortifications. They were formed up in assault lines, rifles loaded, bayonets fixed. Everything Wolseley had planned had worked perfectly. Wolseley checked his pocket watch one final time. The light was perfect. He looked left and right along his line. He took a deep breath. And then he gave the signal. Bugles sounded across the British line, the first noise the army had made in over 4 hours. The clear notice of the charge rang out, and the 40,000 men surged forward with a roar. The Highland Brigade hit the Egyptian left flank like a tidal wave. The Guards Brigade struck the center with overwhelming force. Indian brigades attacked the right. The thunder of thousands of boots mixed with battle cries, with officers shouting orders, with growing sound of rifle fire as Egyptian soldiers scrambled to their positions. The Egyptians were caught completely unprepared. Soldiers stumbled out of shelters grabbing weapons, trying to understand what was happening. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Some Egyptian soldiers managed to get to their posts and start firing, but it was too late. The surprise was too complete. The British were too close, moving too fast. The fighting became brutal close quarters combat. British and the Egyptian soldiers fought at close range, too close for rifles, relying on bayonets and the rifle butts. But British discipline held. Soldiers had been trained for exactly this. They fought in ranks, supporting each other. The British soldiers were also equipped with percussion-top rifles, more reliable and faster to reload than matchlock muskets most Egyptian forces used. The battle lasted about 45 minutes from initial bugles to collapse of organized Egyptian resistance. Within that first half hour, the Highland Brigade had captured the Egyptian left flank. The Guards had taken the center. Indian brigades had secured the right. Egyptian units began to collapse. Soldiers fleeing, trying to retreat in good order. But panic spread. The organized defense disintegrated into chaos. Then came the cavalry. British cavalry units thundered forward, hundreds of mounted soldiers at full gallop, swords drawn. The cavalry's job wasn't indiscriminate slaughter but preventing the Egyptian army from reforming, from establishing new defensive positions. Where Egyptian units tried to form squares, cavalry would threaten them. Where soldiers were fleeing, cavalry would pursue. By mid-morning, it was over. Urabi's army had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Thousands of Egyptian soldiers were dead or wounded. Thousands more were prisoners. Egyptian artillery had been captured. British losses, by brutal standards of 19th century warfare, were remarkably light, about 57 killed, roughly 400 wounded. In total, around 450 British casualties from an army of 40,000, a casualty rate of just over 1%. But numbers don't capture human reality. Every casualty was a person. Every dead soldier had a family who would mourn him. Every wounded man faced pain and possibly lifelong disabilities. Egyptian wounded faced even worse conditions. Men were never reached by medical help. They lay on the battlefield or crawled awake to die alone. Urabi himself wasn't at Tel El Kebir when the battle began. He'd gone to Cairo the previous evening. When news reached him at dawn that his army was under assault, he rushed back. But he was too late. By the time he could have reached the battlefield, the outcome was already decided. With the army destroyed, the road to Cairo lay open. Wolseley didn't hesitate. On September 14, just one day after the battle, advanced British units were marching toward Cairo. By evening, British scouts were on the outskirts. There was no more Battle of Cairo. Urabi, recognizing further fighting was futile, decided to surrender. On September 15, Urabi formally surrendered to British authorities. The Urabi Revolt, the nationalist uprising that had threatened British interests and dominated Egyptian politics for over a year, was over. Wolseley's troops occupied Cairo. British sentries appeared on street corners. Egyptian civilians who'd hoped Urabi might win watched their nationalist aspirations crushed. Urabi faced trial, was convicted of rebellion, and sentenced not to execution but to exile. He was sent to Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, far from Egypt where he couldn't influence events. He lived there for nearly 20 years before finally being allowed to return to Egypt in 1901. By then he was an old man and the political situation had moved on. Closing. For Britain, the victory at Tel El Kebir seemed perfect. Egypt was secure. The route to India was safe. The intervention could be presented as a success. But this victory came with a price that wasn't immediately obvious, a price paid over decades. Britain now effectively occupied Egypt. What had been planned as temporary intervention became permanent presence. British troops remained, initially to maintain stability, then simply because they'd always been there. Egypt became a de facto British protectorate, though officially it remained part of the Ottoman Empire. This occupation created lasting problems. Egyptian nationalists never accepted British rule. The nationalist movement that might have led to independence decades earlier was crushed. Egyptian political development was stunted. The psychological impact of occupation fed into more radical nationalist movements of the 20th century. Britain found itself responsible for defending and administering a country it didn't officially own, draining resources, creating diplomatic complications. But in September tahun 1882, those future problems seemed distant. What mattered immediately was that Wolseley had achieved stunning military success. The night march to Tel El Kebir entered military lore as a masterpiece of planning and execution. Military academies around the world studied the campaign. The principles demonstrated became fundamental to military thinking: the value of surprise, importance of detailed planning, need for realistic training. Let's talk about what made Wolseley's operation so successful. First, intelligence gathering. Wolseley gathered detailed information about Egyptian positions, strengths, defensive arrangements. Second, rehearsal. He made them practice. Units drilled on moving silently in darkness. Third, deception. By conducting probing attacks in days before, he kept Egyptians off balance. Fourth, logistics. Moving 40,000 men required enormous planning. Water, food, ammunition, medical services, all worked out beforehand. Finally, leadership. Wolseley explained the plan to officers, trusted subordinates, and he led by example. The battle influenced military thinking far beyond Britain. German theorists studied it. But we should acknowledge the darker side. From Egyptian perspective, Tel El Kebir wasn't a brilliant military operation. It was the moment their struggle for independence was crushed. Urabi's movement represented genuine nationalist aspirations. The British victory ended the dream for generations. The occupation that followed created resentment feeding into later nationalist movements. Britain finally withdrew from Egypt in 1956, 74 years after Tel El Kebir. There's also the question of whether Britain's intervention was justified. The British argued they were protecting legitimate interests. Egyptian nationalists saw a foreign power invading to protect investments and to maintain control. Both perspectives have validity. What's undeniable is the military brilliance of Wolseley's operation. Consider the challenges: moving 40,000 men across desert in complete darkness, maintaining cohesion without lights, navigating by stars, timing arrival to coincide with dawn, achieving complete surprise. Any one of those tasks would be difficult. Combining them all and succeeding was extraordinary. The personal stories at Human Dimension. Sir was the lieutenant who led his company in initial assault, the surgeon who set up field hospital treating wounded from both sides, the Indian soldiers whose contributions are often overlooked, the Egyptian soldiers who fought bravely but were caught by surprise. Their defeat wasn't due to cowardice but to being caught by better prepared enemy. After the battle, Wolseley became national hero. He was elevated to peerage, received honors and the awards. Later he rose to become commander-in-chief of the British Army. He used that position to push for reforms, modernizing training and the organization. In modern military academies, Tel El Kebir is still taught as case study. Staff officers analyze what Wolseley did right and they consider what lessons apply to contemporary warfare. How do you achieve surprise in an age of satellite surveillance? How do you maintain cohesion when troops might be scattered? These questions don't have easy answers, but studying historical examples helps develop critical thinking. The battle also raises questions about ethics of military force. Wolseley's victory secured British control over Egypt but at cost of Egyptian self-determination. Was that justified? From British perspective in 1882, the answer seemed obvious. From Egyptian perspective then and now, the answer looks very different. Understanding both perspectives is crucial to understanding history honestly. This complexity makes history fascinating. There are rarely simple heroes and the villains. Wolseley was a brilliant general who achieved remarkable victory, but he was also serving imperial system denying self-determination to millions. Urabi was patriot fighting for his country's freedom, but his movement also threatened stability. The soldiers on both sides were brave men doing their duty as they understood it. History isn't simple. The people who lived through Tel El Kebir all had their own perspectives. They all deserve to have their stories remembered and understood. That's what history is, not just facts and the dates, but human experience of living through events that shape the world. If you've stayed with us through this deep dive, thank you. Understanding these complex historical events, seeing both military brilliance and the political consequences, grappling with multiple perspectives, that's what brings history to life. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next exploration. We'll be covering more remarkable military campaigns, political turning points, and the cultural transformations. Hit that like button if you found this valuable. Drop a comment below about what aspect you found most interesting, what other battles you'd like us to cover. Share this with anyone interested in military history. The more people engage with history thoughtfully, understanding complexity rather than simple narratives, the better equipped we all are to understand our present and shape our future. Remember, history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding how we got here. The soldiers who marched through Egyptian desert that September night couldn't have imagined our world today, but their actions helped create it. Thank you for watching. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning from the incredible stories of our past. Cheers!